The decade of the 2000s brought advances in technology, new types of entertainment, and changing trends in music and fashion. Social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter exploded in popularity. Blogging became a hobby and reality TV took over the networks. During this time, we also weathered a series of disasters and devastations, both in the US and globally. It was the decade of 9/11, the war against terror, the housing market crash, and Hurricane Katrina. Some call the 2000s the digital decade. Others call it the disaster decade. Both would be accurate. The 2000s were a time of tech, change, and hardship.
And a story that captured the hearts of Cuban Americans and attracted worldwide attention. A story that involved the Pope, Fidel Castro, and the U.S. government. It was the story of Elian Gonzalez.
At the beginning of this decade of the United States, in Colombia, were in a natural custody battle for a 5-year-old boy. Elian Gonzalez was a Cuban boy found alone on a raft in a Gulf of Mexico 3 miles from Florida on Thanksgiving Day, 1999. After his mother took him and fled from Communist Lake Colombia. His Cuban American family wanted him to stay in the United States, but his Caribbean father wanted him back in Cuba. It was a huge battle for custody all over the news, but in the end, President Clinton decided he should return to that in Colombia. The Gulf in Mexico brought more tragedy in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina came along.
Hurricane Katrina was one of the deadliest storms in United States history. It began in late August of 2005 as a tropical depression that formed over the Bahamas. Meteorologists warned people that a large storm was going to hit the Gulf Coast states, and evacuations began on August 28th. Because the average elevation of the city of New Orleans lies below sea level and is surrounded by water, it was especially at risk. The neighborhoods where the poorest and most vulnerable people lived were the most likely to be flooded. Before the storm hit, nearly 80% of the city's population was evacuated, and 10,000 people were seeking shelter at the Superdome Stadium that was located on higher ground and was a designated shelter. Unfortunately, tens of thousands of people refused to leave home. Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in the early morning of August 29th. By 9 a.m., many areas were beneath water and people were on rooftops trying to reach safety. By the time the hurricane was over, almost 80% of the city of New Orleans was under some quantity of water, and in some places, the water did not recede for weeks. The hurricane also hit other parts of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, but the worst destruction by far was in the city of New Orleans, and it especially devastated poor families, leaving them with no food, shelter, or water. More than 1 million people in the Gulf region were displaced by the storm, and 70% of New Orleans housing was damaged in the storm. According to CNN, it was the costliest disaster in the history of the global insurance industry. The storm caused over $100 billion in damage, and recovery and rebuilding is still going on today. The most devastating effect of Hurricane Katrina is that it killed almost 2,000 people. Hurricane Katrina was the worst natural disaster in the 2000s, but this decade was also affected by a man-made disaster, the housing market crash.
We're down by between 3 and 4.5% generally across these markets. Let's talk about the speed with which we are watching this market deteriorate. We're red everywhere, essentially, down by 4-5%.
We're down over 16%.
Close to the end of this decade, United States underwent another market crash. In 2007, the housing market went to an all-time low. In October 2007, it was at its highest of 1576, then to its lowest in March of 676. The Federal Reserve and banks came up with new ideas on how an average consumer could borrow money or buy a home. Due to its financial innovations that included interest-adjustable loans, interest-only loans, and zero-down loans that would help the economy grow and motivate many consumers to invest and buy homes. This system that they were implying would allow an average American and buying a home at any cost. Due to this, banks were allowing any consumer to purchase a home without really checking their financial status. They would also lie to the banks with false credibility that would allow in paper for the banks to finance a house loan. At the end, the buyer did not have the financial stability to pay for the actual loan, and many buyers went into bankruptcy, lost their jobs, and bought more than they could afford, and this caused the housing market to fall. This man-made disaster may have brought another tragedy in the 2000s, but the 2000s wasn't just filled with disaster. It was also a decade of great movies and games.
Though climate change has been occurring for a while, it had been publicly acknowledged by 2006 when Al Gore supported Thompson's An Inconvenient Truth. As icebergs melt, polar life will lose land and will have to move in hopes to survive. Drought will start to drag on, and as hurricanes increase with intensity and frequency, and the ocean shall rise from all the melted ice, emerging land underwater. Climate change was finally being recognized by people in the 2000s. It brought both fear and controversy that impacted the decade. In our mural, we placed the water across the bottom and taking over most of the left side. Then an iceberg fills the mid-right as the stock line goes through the middle. Our choice of color is mostly blue with purples and white, along with other dark colors. The obvious reason is water in the iceberg that take up most of the mural, along with the sky, are blue, also because it helps show disaster and ominous or bad things. The perspective is as if you are in the rushing water and looking out to the coast.